I'm Mike.
I'm Jason.
Welcome to Snake Envy. So, we're going to tackle something today that I think is highly confusing for hobbyists, particularly for beginners. It's crucial for breeders to know all this stuff. But we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between localities and morphs and lines. And I was going to kick it off with an analogy because I think sometimes hobbyists and pet owners get a little too caught up in this stuff. We have two beehives. And when it comes to honeybees, there are several different varieties. I don't think a lot of people know that. And they're essentially localities. Like one is from Russia, one is from Italy. There's a popular one here in the Mountain West that comes from Western Canada. And it would be the equivalent of, I think, in snakes, a line, where a breeder took a couple different varieties of honeybees and he created a hybrid that would survive winter really well. But here's the kicker. When a queen bee goes out to mate, she's not going to mate necessarily with her own drones. So people in the honeybee world get really caught up in, well, I want a particular type of honeybee. But as soon as your queen goes out and mates,
who knows?
You're left with mutts anyway. I always joke in honeybees that after a generation, it's a mutt anyway. So your purebred that you started with is irrelevant. Now that doesn't necessarily happen in the snake world, but same thing. I think hobbyists sometimes get a little too caught up in the specifics of the snakes because if you're not going to breed them, to a degree, who cares?
Yeah, it's a nice pet.
It's a nice pet, yes. So let's start with definitions. What is a locality?
A locality is a specific location where an animal is found or a project to start a group of animals was collected and then bred together. You can still selectively breed a locality to get a specific look, but these animals come from this mountain range or this valley or whatever. And that's what a locality is. And there's lots of funny names out there. And it gets confusing, especially if you're just jumping in to the hobby. There's so much terminology in morphs, localities, and lines, and even like names of just, breeders.
Right, which is kind of what I consider lines. Now, the interesting thing, too, about localities, breeders, you've shared with me, we're not going to be specific, but you've shared with me an example of a snake you breed that you don't want people to know where it came from because you don't want people to go out and poach in that area.
Well, even if they're doing it legally.
Or even if they're doing it legally,
I worked hard.
It's going to diminish.
Yes,
yeah.
You worked hard to find these animals in certain places, and you just don't want to go, hey, everybody, come to my place and wreck it.
Exactly. Or if another breeder learns about it, he may go out and collect some of them if he likes the way yours looks. So now you're going to diminish the value of them out on the market. So,
and it doesn't mean that I won't share it
eventually.
But publicly, you don't really.
Right.
But like if you're selling to a customer, you obviously want to share the details.
But that's interesting from a pet owner or a hobbyist perspective because even if your animal is sold without a locality, could be, there is one. Breeder just doesn't want anybody to know about it yet. All right, what's a morph?
A morph is generally in colubrids, and because we're colubrid guys, at least I am, is a recessive trait. Now there is some codoms. You got an incomplete dominance, like Pacific gophers, striped Pacific gophers. It's an incomplete dominance. You can breed a stripe to a normal that's totally non-related. You will get stripes first generation. That's an incomplete dominance.
Now, can't morphs also be pattern or color?
Patterns and colors,
Right.
generally.
But one example would be, a good example would be California king snakes, where depending on how far north or south or east or west you are in their range, their colors can vary from black to brown to tan to white, yellow, cream.
And a lot of that's the locality stuff.
They can have a ton of contrast. They can have very little contrast between the pattern and the body color. So you've got color variation. You've also got pattern coloration between bandeds and stripe. There's kind of the highway thing where you even end up with broken stripes, dashes. So within that one species, in a relatively small range in the southwest part of the country and northern Mexico, there's a lot of variety in both pattern and color. But those occur naturally.
Yeah.
Now, line, what would be the difference between a line and a morph?
A line is someone that developed a specific look and has refined it. And so, like, this is the Envy line of Sonoran gophers. You get this specific look. That's just an example.
But that's selective breeding. It's line breeding, where you're taking a specific trait and you're trying to repeat it over generations.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and you can have you could take any species and they a hognose, and they can look different than these other hognose because they're bred to look a certain way. It's kind of a sticky situation because there's line breeding and then there's just traits that they just look that way, and
you may or may not be able to replicate it.
Right.
I tend to think of morphs of being a little more naturally occurring. That doesn't mean that you can't breed two of the same morph together and replicate it, but it's a little more natural occurring where the lines, and oftentimes the lines take on the name of a breeder, the locality goes out the window, sometimes the morph goes out the window, and if they're very successful, then you have, the name of a breeder that lives on forever through his effort and through his or her and the line breeding of specific traits. Where it gets confusing from my perspective as a hobbyist, for a breeder, you've got to know this stuff. And there's demand for certain morphs. There's demand for certain lines.
And then you get a combination of both, a locality color morph.
Exactly.
And there's many examples of that. I have Feline California Great Basin gophers, and
so Felin's the locality.
Yeah, it's
blonde is the morph.
Yeah, and it's not a recessive thing; it's a line bred trait, and so, but then you got Kingsville Red Bulls, and that's a color morph and a locality together.
And where it gets really confusing in our hobby is we don't do a good job of always including all the info that someone might find interesting, or like in localities, we often have the name of a county or the name of a mountain range or the name of a valley, the name of a city. But that's it. We don't know what state. Now, people learn over time where they're from. But we were talking about Miami County. Well, Miami County where? It turns out it's Kansas.
Well, Miami County Xanthic bull.
Xanthic bull snakes.
And so, where's Miami County? And so
it turns out it's in Kansas.
And a lot of that information, it's just a lot of breeders just have stuff in their head and they don't even think to break that down.
Well, and it's also inside knowledge. I mean, those of you who have been breeding for a long time, you share that lingo and you just know. It wouldn't surprise me either over time if some breeders don't even know or don't even care what state it's from. You just know what it is.
Right. Well, and a huge one is gray-banded king snakes. You got all these tons of different localities, and some of these localities are like super close to each other.
And they're only like a mile long.
And some of these,
or they're, it's a road.
Well, yeah. Well, eagle. I had some gray-banded king snakes. They were eagle's nest, and when I bought the things at the time, It's like, well, where's Eagle's Nest? Turns out it's I believe Langtree is the locality, but you cross a bridge, and on the other side of the bridge, there's a dead tree with an eagle's nest in it, and it's like, so it comes from right there, right specifically there, and it is a locality inside of a locality, kind of. So, and a lot of these, and it gets really sticky with, they really want to keep it to Pacific ranges, even though they might be a mile apart. And then you can get some other, projects where localities just in that same county. They can be miles and miles apart.
Right.
So it's just...
Can be hundreds of square miles.
It gets really sticky.
Gray bandeds are fascinating because you can go to the map, and a lot of times of West Texas, and based on the name of the locality, you can actually just search. Like I have a Juneau Road. I search Juneau Road, Texas, and there is a highway called Juneau Road, and you can kind of see where it starts and where it ends. And and on Google, with Google Earth, you can actually see what the terrain looked like. And so it is pretty interesting when you dive into the localities, but it's not always easy to figure out where they were from. Gray banded kings are a little easier because they have such a small range, a small geographic range, but for some of them it really gets out there.
And people don't mention, like when you're talking about Alterna gray bands,
right,
they don't even say what state, because they're almost all of them are Texas.
Correct. Almost all are from
Although
West
they
Texas.
range into New Mexico and Mexico.
And Mexico, yeah.
But I don't know if there's, I think there's a locality in New Mexico in the hobby. I don't even know if there might be a Mexican locality, and there's a lot more that they're not available to the hobby, but...
And a lot of that depends on the local laws in those areas. So in Texas, it's actually pretty easy to go and collect them. That may not be the case in New Mexico. It's certainly going to be more difficult in Mexico than it is in either of the two U.S. states. But I'm betting it's more complicated in New Mexico than Texas.
Well, yeah, it's definitely hard there. Not that gray bands are easy to find. But.
Yeah. Well, that's the other part of it.
Yeah.
Now, again, I think the question from the hobbyist perspective, from my perspective, is, do we sometimes get a little too caught up in all this? At the end of the day, there's two things that hobbyists and pet owners need to know. One, if your animal has specific genetic traits or it's a popular locality, you're going to pay more for it. So it ultimately boils down, you may have two California king snakes, for example, that look virtually identical. There's really very little difference between them, but in terms of cost, there could be another $100 or $150 on top of one because of either genetic traits that it's het for, or it comes from a preferred locality.
Yeah.
And so you do have to factor that in. But at the end of the day, if money's not an option, then yes, some of this stuff, if it matters to you, just know that you might have to pay for it. But for the average pet owner, and you're not going to breed them, it doesn't make a ton of difference to know which locality your California king snake is, other than curiosity.
Right.
Like I say, it is fun to go to the map sometimes and look.
It is.
And see.
And going back to gray bands, it's like, you have these locality ones, and they can be expensive, especially the rare ones. But you can get a beautiful snake that has no locality data. They usually call that a generic, but it can be a stunning animal and a great pet still.
Yes.
And if you're just a hobbyist and you don't intentionally breed, why would you go for a locality when you can save a few bucks and get a beautiful animal still?
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. Okay, let's talk a little bit about pet peeves. From my vantage point, it's just, the whole thing is just confusing. Trying to keep track of what a locality is versus what a line. There's a point where I just say, who cares? I want an animal that I like, and the other stuff doesn't really matter. Now, from a breeder's perspective, what are some of the pet peeves? I know sometimes people call the same thing two different things. What gets to be frustrating from a breeder's perspective?
For me, one of my pet peeves is naming a color morph a color morph, I'll take Trumbauer Hypo for an example. Super variable. Many different looks inside my collection alone. They're still Trumbauer Hypos. They're not raspberries or, like, I'm not going to break down all the names.
Now, Trumbauer, just for those who don't know, is a line. And Trumbauer was a breeder.
Craig Trumbauer came up with that line, and that's why it's called Trumbauer. And that's a way of distinguishing that line from Stillwater Hypos, which is a whole nother kind of pet peeve. Like people want to call them Trumbauer's a name, so it's not like it's just you can call them Trumbauers all day long and they look different than that. But when you call it a Hypo Stillwater, that's a locality. Stillwater is a locality, and so you gotta be careful the way you word that, because this is a Stillwater Hypo. Well, it's het for albino and this and that. Well, it's definitely not locality anymore.
Well, and to make Stillwater even more confusing, the true locality animals that still would be considered the normal Stillwater, they're very rare in the hobby. Everybody was drawn to the Hypo, and so
created the phase.
When you hear Stillwater now, I think 90% of the time in the hobby, you're really talking about a morph.
Right.
That has been selected, and now it's been selected for. So it really gets confusing.
Well, and you got to be careful too, because some are still locality.
Yes.
And some are not, and they can look the exact same.
Yeah.
But now you're starting to see a lot of variations in the Stillwater gene because they're mixed with all these different colors and even localities, I guess.
Yeah.
But it just changes looks. If you breed a Stillwater to a Kankakee bull, which is two localities, they're no longer localities, but that's going to change the whole look of the animal because you're mixing two different looks.
And for those that don't know, a Kankakee, which comes from Illinois, and the Stillwaters that are further south in Oklahoma, the Kankakees are much, much darker. The true Stillwater normals, they have a lot of black in them, and they have a lot of contrast, but the base color is much lighter.
Yeah.
Whereas a Kankakee, you're talking about a darker base color on top of black on top of that. They're very dark. So in theory, you'd end up with kind of in between. And you'd probably bring some yellow into the Kankakee and some red.
And some darks.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot to digest, and you're not going to learn this stuff overnight, especially when you first get in the hobby and you're just like, you see some funny things.
Well, and it's interesting. That's why we talk about the two different perspectives. You as a breeder and me as a hobbyist. I've been keeping snakes off and on for 40 years, and I don't have it all straight. But part of it is because it's less important for me to get it straight. Yeah. You need to know it.
I know a lot, but I'm learning every day.
Yeah, exactly. Any other pet peeves?
That's
the big one.
That's one of my big ones.
Where it really gets confusing is when two different breeders are kind of doing the same thing and they end up with two different names. Now, some of that I think is intentional, just to set their animals apart. Some of it I think could even be less intentional, but it's definitely confusing when you start calling essentially the same looking animal two different things. My personal pet peeve is hypo. There's a subjective component to hypo, isn't there? There's both a genetic, but there's also a little bit of subjectivity in the visual. As far as how much black is too much.
Sometimes they're misnamed, and
and
people think everything is genetically black and white, and there's stuff that I don't know what it is, like a rusty Sonoran. I have no idea what to call that morph, but it's nothing. It's not a textbook morph. It's something all on its own.
But sometimes I see pictures of three different hypos, and I say, well, had you just asked me cold, is this hypo? I would have said no to two of them. But they are. But so there is a little subjectivity in some of these too.
And they're
reduced black or lack of black can both be hypo.
Yeah, and it really depends what species you're dealing with, because not every species of hypo, like a hypo king snake compared to a hypo bull snake, they're just not the same.
Right,
and it's genetically, and they probably wouldn't even line up to create anything.
Not
like
only
if you
that,
tried to do
but in some species like gophers and bulls, we use the term hypo a lot. But in king snakes, you don't typically hear king snakes referred to as hypo, even if they're brown instead of black. But technically they could be. I showed you my wild caught Great Basin gopher. I think she fits the description of hypo. I don't think she has any black, maybe a little bit on her head, but her darkest colors are deep brown. Could be she's hypo, but there's no way to know. She was
you would have to
legally collected in the wild. You'd have to prove it out.
Yeah, you'd have to line breed it and prove it out and test breeding, and there's a lot of work that goes into that, and it may not go anywhere.
Exactly. So I hope we cleared some things up. I doubt it.
Hope we didn't make it worse.
Hope we didn't make it worse. But I think the main message is breeders, this is something they're knee deep in, and this is something that they've got to know. I think for the hobbyists, it's not something we have to get too caught up in.
Yeah, but if you want to know, just ask the person you're purchasing animals through, and just say, hey, give me all the background on this particular animal.
Personally, my favorite thing about localities is I typically name my snakes based on the locality. I go to a map, I look up the history of the native people that lived in that area, and I usually get my snake names from either geography or from native references, and that's fun for me because now the name is also associated with where the snake would have lived in the wild had it not been captive bred. Hopefully we didn't make it worse.
Ask questions if you...
Please, ask us in the comments. We'd be happy to answer, and this guy's an expert on all of it. If we don't know the answer, we'll find the answer. Thank you.
Thanks.